hear what's going on. And most of the time, your lines will be muted to reduce interference. But there's a little sign on your control panel, which in effect raises your hand, so then I can see that somebody would like to speak. And we might do that, but you can also write messages in the question box to send items for discussion. And I will be reading those. I'm Robert Cherney, the president of EPAC, and I'm acting as the moderator for this webinar. And I will see your questions. And if they're a sort of question that's that should be raised at that point in the webinar, I'll do so. If it's something that looks like it would be better left for a later point in the webinar, then I'll do that too. I'd like to just point out that the presentation is being recorded. Mark, could you check that she started the recording? That the presentation will be recorded, and the presentation, both the slides and the recording, will be on our website. How quickly, I don't know, but the last one we got on fairly quickly. So here we go. Just to let those of you who are not aware, our vision is of a world where people in organizations are ethically aware and act ethically, and our main way of promoting ethical practices in organization and supporting ethics practitioners across Canada is by networking and educational opportunities and activities, of which, of course, this webinar is one. And please do visit our website and become a member if you are not already a member. So everybody is important in this webinar, the participants as well, the presenters. Dr. Greg Levine will lead the presentation, and you'll see his very, very short details about him at the end of the presentation. And Dr. Louis Haeck will also be participating. This whole webinar started when I heard Dr. Levine at a conference last September, and his knowledge seemed to be so comprehensive, and his manner of presenting it very compelling, that I invited him to do this presentation. And I had already met Louis previously, and I knew that he was working as an ombudsman with Via Rail. So I thought to hear from somebody who's got this on his daily plate would also be interesting. So they've interchanged in putting this presentation together. And everyone is invited to join in. So please offer your comments and questions at any time by raising your hand or by writing them in the question box. If we don't do them right away, we'll get to them for the final discussion. Et parmi nous, Louis Haeck lui-même et moi aussi, nous pouvons comprendre vos questions en français et poser vos questions et offrir vos commentaires, vos observations si vous le voulez en français. Et entre Louis et moi, nous irons traduire au fur et à mesure lorsque c'est nécessaire, et on va continuer dans ce sens aussi. And now I'm going to hand it over to Greg to start doing the presentation. And I just have to click on the appropriate.
Okay. There we are. Excuse me, sorry. Thanks very much for the chance to talk about Ombudsman. Ombudsman is close to my heart. It's something I've worked in a long time. I was General Counsel for the Provincial Ombudsman of BC for many years, and I've had the chance to work with other ombudsmen. And in a rather bizarre episode, I was ombudsman for a day or two at a particular institution, which will remain nameless. Stranger experiences in my life. But Ombudsman is a tool that can be very useful. And indeed, the Supreme Court of Canada calls it, the Ombudsman legislation in British Columbia called it the paradigm of remedial legislation, because of the ability one has to investigate and to report on and to find resolution of problems. ombudsman. That's in something called the parliamentary or classical model, and I will talk about that a bit. So just looking at the outline, if we could go to that slide. Thanks. I'll look at it just briefly. I'm going to go briefly over the slides to give us more chance to chat about things, and also Louis to ensure he has a chance to give his perspective on a variety of these issues. So I'll look at what ombudsman's about, some of the types, what are ombudsman standards, a bit where they come from, some of the methods which are different between ombudsman, and powers and protection. So if we go to that first introductory slide on types of ombudsman. Next slide, please. Thanks. So what I've taken here are 3 definitions from different organizations, and the websites, the URLs for these are at the back of this presentation. So you should be able to find them easily. The first type is often called the classical ombudsman. This is a parliamentary or legislative ombudsman, which is to say they're created by statute and or bylaw. Typically in Canada, it's been by statute. Although that will change, I suspect, in Ontario, which has facilitated the creation of local ombudsmen, and in Quebec, this is also the case that there are a number of local ombudsmen. So a classical ombudsman does what I was saying at the start. They receive and investigate complaints, and then they report on them, and they try to effect resolution either before or after the report. Organizational ombudsmen are ombudsmen who deal with dispute resolution within their organization. And finally, the FCO website definition is more general again, and that's that an ombudsman or ombudsperson assists with the expeditious and fair resolution of complaints. Each one of these, you will have noted, stresses confidentiality, impartiality, and independence. And I'll chat a bit more about that in a minute. One of the things I wanted to say at this stage, though, a classical ombudsman is typically a public ombudsman. That is to say, deals with public institutions. The other type, organizational, sometimes called executive ombudsman, may be private or public sector. Okay, so just briefly, I'd like to chat about the name, and that's on the next slide. The word is Swedish, and there was incredible debate on this in the 90s in Canada among the ombudsmen who were provincial ombudsmen about whether that name should be kept or changed to ombudsperson and so on. The debate amongst the provincial ombuds was that it should be kept as ombudsman, but then lo and behold, BC came along and in the 2000s changed it to ombudsperson anyway, and that was done not really consulting legislative ombudsman. They just decided to do it. There are many, many executive ombudsmen throughout Canada and the world, and they're variously called ombudsperson, and sometimes names like fair practices commissioners. You occasionally see the term ombuds, supposedly to be neutral in some sense. It's less common than ombudsperson, and ombudsman is still the sort of classical name, and that's what I will tend to use as I go through this. So thanks. So let's go on to the next slide. Broadly speaking, there are slews of ombuds types, but fairness is a very common theme. You're looking for fair resolution of problems, complaints about administrative actions of both public and private sector ombudsmen. Fairness, that's the key word, a common theme. And what's fairness? So I'll just look at that for a minute. Next slide, please. The dictionary defines it as impartial and just treatment. Typically, we talk about both procedural and substantive fairness. Procedural fairness is, well, not self-evident, but it is about the process itself. You want processes which are unbiased, unprejudiced, non-prejudicial, and you want process where an individual can understand the treatment that she or he has been given, and that he or she can respond meaningfully to that. In short, you want a kind of transparency in process. Substantive fairness is really about outcomes that are merited. What are fair and just results? Some ombudsmen, provincial ombudsmen, other legislative ombudsmen can deal with both these. Some ombudsmen can only deal with procedural fairness. Although in my experience, it's actually the case that most deal with both, and whether they are organizational or parliamentary. Okay, just a brief note on the types again. That's the next slide. There are so many different names of classical, legislative, parliamentary. All of those are intended to refer to ombudsmen which are created by a legislature. And they are empowered by that legislature. And I'll talk more about the power in a few minutes. The other way of differentiating ombudsmen is, do they have general jurisdiction versus specialty or restricted jurisdiction? One example of this is to look at provincial ombudsmen, which have very general jurisdiction over various institutions within the province that they are ombudsmen. So British Columbia is about the widest jurisdiction. They have jurisdiction over municipalities and all government ministries, all crown corporations, professional colleges, universities, schools, hospitals, very, very broad. Recently in Ontario, the jurisdiction's been extended for the provincial ombudsman to municipalities and other institutions.
Excuse me, Greg.
Yeah.
Excuse me. We've had a couple of comments about people having a bit of difficulty hearing.
Oh, okay.
So please get as close as you can to your microphone,
okay.
and be sure to enunciate as clearly as possible. I think it's just a matter of the type of equipment, and there's not much we can do about it, but that would help. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, hopefully this will be better.
That sounds a bit better already. Thank you.
Okay.
Oops.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. General versus specialty or restricted jurisdiction. So I described a couple of provincial ombuds who have very general jurisdiction over a wide range of institutions. Then you contrast that with, say, a specialty ombudsman. For instance, some of the freedom of information commissioners and privacy commissioners throughout Canada are essentially specialty ombudsmen. They don't have order power. They act in an ombudsman-like way. So, for instance, in Manitoba, the information commissioner, information and privacy commissioner is actually literally the ombudsman of Manitoba. Okay. I'd like to talk a bit about standards, and that's the next slide. And this is what I'm trying to get at here. There are standards by which the ombudsman themselves form opinions after they've investigated something. And then there are the ethics through which ombudsmen conduct their own work. They should be behaving in an ethical manner when they do their own work. So the sources of work standards in legislation, again at the provincial level, you see administrative justice codes actually embedded in the legislation. In other executive types, standards may be set by contract or policy, and they may be subject to negotiation. The sources of ethics standards, besides one's ethical compass, which we hope we all have something of, associations such as the Forum of Canadian Ombudsmen have written ethics codes for ombudsmen, or sets of principles. They aren't mandatory, but they're what hope that people will follow. And I just direct you to the website to have a look at those. And in terms of the administrative justice codes, I'm going to go over part of them, but looking at any provincial ombudsman act, you will see, an administrative justice code embedded within. It might not be called that, but it is in there. So I'm just going to go to an example in Ontario, Section 21, which is the next slide. This is very broad, but it's what the ombudsman is asked to opine on. So the ombudsman gets a complaint, decides it's within his or her jurisdiction, then moves on to an investigation, gathers facts on whatever the administrative problem is, and then has to decide, in a sense, whether there's a problem or not. And if there is a problem, what is it? And so if you look at 21.1 and you look at those things, so was this something that was against the law? Was it an administrative act by a ministry or a municipality that was contrary to law? Was this act unreasonable, unjust, oppressive, or improperly discriminatory? I mean, these are very broad, but they're also incredibly powerful and subtle. And in wise hands, they can help us understand administrative action and inappropriate administrative action in a really profound way. One of the things I'd say about this is at the provincial level, several ombudsmen have taken it upon themselves to write out what they thought each of those terms meant. So you can find that kind of guidance on their websites. BC's is the Administrative Justice Code 2003, in which it discusses this sort of stuff, each of the terms. And Saskatchewan's done the same. There's an older document from Nova Scotia called the Tools of the Trade document, which is very useful, and so on. Some of the city of Toronto had, I don't know if it's still continuing, but had a descriptive section on these kind of terms as well. And one of my favorites is that last one. Something was simply wrong. And that's interesting because it forces the ombudsman to think about right and wrong in a very profound way. Because if it hasn't been one of the previous three, well, it's just an interesting notion. Okay, looking at an example too of the FCO statement, which is on the next slide. This is about ombudsman ethics, and it's sorry, excuse me. Looking at they see elements of ethics in independence, impartiality, fairness, confidentiality, and credibility. And they are about ethics, although they're all something like independence is also about power relations. But being independent is a very important, and acting in an independent way is very important in the ombudsman role, because if they're not seen to be independent, they will be seen, in a sense, to be biased, and that's really not helpful. Okay, so I'm going to switch a bit to, and I'm happy to talk about any of these terms at any point, but I'm going to switch a bit to core methods, and then we'll just have a few more slides, and then we can go to a more general discussion. This really, what the method of an ombudsman is, depends on their mandate and how they were established. So in the classical model, the legislative model, it's about investigating and reporting. There is within the Ombudsman Act a really profound faith in the gathering of facts. It's a really basic notion. It's almost empiricist in the scientific sense, that if you gather the facts, solutions to problems will become apparent. And it's deeply embedded in the classical model. So you investigate something, and you use various techniques to investigate and also to resolve a problem. But the core method is finding those facts. You apprehend the parameters and the details of the problem, and those lead to solutions. It's not. It's as though the solutions will pop out of that understanding, which isn't always the case, but it's almost intuitive within the writing of the statutes themselves that that's what's expected. Other ombudsmen may not be investigative. They may be mediative. They may be mediators. They may be actually helping parties resolve their own, whatever the problem is. And so their function's a bit different. They certainly have to come to know the facts, but they may know them in a different way, in the sense how the parties characterize the facts, for example. And then there are what you could characterize as hybrid. Someone who's written a lot about this is Nora Farrell, who is the chair, I think, still of the FCO, or certainly was last year, who's written on this notion of hybridity, that executive ombudsmen often have both investigative and mediative roles, and indeed core functions. Okay, I'd like to briefly look at powers, which is the next. Yeah, thanks. Okay, and here there really is an extraordinary range in the ombudsman world of what the powers of various ombudsmen are. So the legislative ombudsman has really incredibly strong investigative powers, which includes subpoenas and summonses. They can literally summons people to witnesses to give information and subpoena documents and so on. And there are powers that if you talk to the provincial ombudsman and some of the municipal ombudsmen who have those powers, they don't use them often, but they have them. And they have that ability to get things that may be withheld. There are some limitations on the ability of the ombudsman to investigate. For instance, when there's an appeal on the merits of a problem, the ombudsman has to wait till that appeal process is gone through. And sometimes, in some provinces, the Attorney General is able to certify that a matter ought not to be investigated. And that has happened from time to time. And the final thing is the power of report. In some sense, it's an obligation to report, but it's also an incredible tool. And the various provinces characterize the ability to report differently. BC's is probably the widest in the sense that it has a direct section saying that the ombudsperson may report publicly whenever she wants to on a given matter. And that's really the broadest in the country. Typically, you report to the institution you've investigated, then to the government as a whole, and then to the legislature. That's the typical route for the provincial ombudsman. And municipally, that may be a report to council instead of the legislature. On the executive side or the organizational side, this just varies very considerably how one acts. There are some issues, though, that relate to powers around protections, which this difference matters a lot. I'd just say in terms of investigation, if you don't have the power of a compulsive power of some sort, you can be limited in your ability to investigate. In terms of protections, which is the next slide, if we can change the slide then. Oh, thanks. Again, there's wide variation. So in the legislative model, there are confidentiality provisions, and it means that nobody can compel the ombudsman to go to court, for instance. Or, and there are also witness protections. Often they're the same protections before the ombudsman as a witness would have before the court. There are sometimes legislated anti-reprisal sections. There are often obstruction provisions. So if somebody obstructs the work of the ombudsman, they can be taken to court. Probably the key one about these is the confidentiality provision, because ombudsmen typically operate in a climate of confidentiality. It's very important to their work to be able to maintain confidences, whether they be of witnesses or parties or however one wants to characterize. And because they're legislated, it is just a real advantage of the legislative model. This isn't to say, though, that the executive model can't function, and of course it does, and it functions well in various organizations. But there's more chance to breach confidentiality, and there is more, ostensibly anyway, chance to review in courts and tribunals. One of the key problems, though, is confidentiality, and there's been a lot of discussion about how to protect that at the executive level. There is some common law protection respecting confidentiality, particularly for those who are mediators, because there seems to be a growing notion of mediation privilege. And that's really all I want to say at the moment. I have some discussion questions, and perhaps Louis would like to give his comments.
Okay, thank you, Greg. I'm going to open Louis' microphone now, and I'll leave yours open, Greg, as well, so the two of you can exchange on certain points that would bear clarification. So, Louis, you're on now, and Greg has invited you to comment. Where do you want to start?
I just want to start with a legal notice that my limited experience is with the executive ombudsman job. I was never involved in the classical ombudsman function. And as Greg mentioned, they are quite different because of the limited power that we have in the executive ombudsman role. So I'm sure that Greg could intervene and give a lot of experience with his classical ombudsman function, but all my remarks will be more geared to the executive type from an organizational perspective. Greg, do you agree with that?
Yes, certainly. Sorry. Yeah.
So
well,
where do you want to begin, Greg, now?
Well, could the two of you talk a little bit about the independence issue? Because the executive version can be carried out by somebody who is in fact an employee of the organization that has set it up. It's not somebody who is at arm's length. So could you talk about some of the independence challenges? And Louis, perhaps you'd like to start because you've been carrying this out for a while.
Yes, with pleasure. Just want to give you my experience at Katimavik Corporation at the federal level when I was the ombudsman there. When I arrived, I was the first ombudsman for Katimavik, and the president of Katimavik asked me to report to him. So I said, I have a legal problem. I could not report to the president of Katimavik. It's a conflict of interest. I'm not an employee of Katimavik. I don't want to report it to anyone in the management because I want to remain impartial and remain neutral. So it was, to say the least, a big discussion, and it did reach the board of directors of Katimavik. And I said, you have the option. I will not be your ombudsman because I will resign because I don't want to report to your president because he is member of management. I must be completely neutral. I cannot report to someone in the management. It's affecting my impartiality. So finally, the board of directors decide that they change the line of reporting, and I will no longer report to the president, and I will report directly to the board of directors, to the audit committee. And that solution satisfied me. I did accept the mandate, and because I want to make sure to protect, as you mentioned, the neutrality and the impartiality of the function. It's very important that I'm not part of management and I don't report to management, in my view, to avoid any conflict of interest or even potential appearance of conflict of interest. Greg, do you agree with that, or?
Sorry. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that it is important to maintain some distance in the way that you're describing. I should say that some executive ombuds types are constructed as almost an interplay between parties. So you see this at the university level, where an ombuds may be appointed both by the university and by the student, and so they're trying to build in a kind of independence. On the classical level, the legislature, the ombudsman reports to the legislature, is an officer of the legislature. But you know, it's interesting across the country. It varies a great deal about who actually makes the appointment. Some it's the executive council, right? The lieutenant governor and council, and you could still say that's a bias. BC's is interesting because it's an all-party committee has to unanimously recommend the candidate, and the legislature has to adopt. Now, it can be a majority vote. It doesn't have to be unanimous at that point. But the appointment is by the lieutenant governor, not the lieutenant governor and council. And the idea of that was to get as independent as you could get. So yeah, I think you can structure things, and it's important whether it's executive or classical to structure things so that there is apparent independence. But could I just want to add one other thought, because it's not the structure of independence is really important, but it's not sufficient. The actual independence, the independence of mind and thought, are very important. You can have a classical ombudsman who doesn't really do very much because he or she doesn't want to offend the powers that be, doesn't want to deal with problems in a way, and ombudsmen almost inevitably are going to attract attention because of the kind of problems that come before them. And if you're not prepared to actually independently deal with those problems, then the structural independence is not, it's important, but it doesn't get you the whole way to what you need in an ombudsman. Does that make any sense?
Maybe I would like, if it's possible, to add just one comment to help the ombudsmen who are employee of the organization and reporting to someone in management. My advice to them usually when I discuss, I understand sometimes for budget reason or for organizational structure, they must report to someone in the management and not outside like the board of directors. I do suggest that they have a very good link with the General Counsel of that organization and also the outside auditor of that organization to make sure that if someone is complaining against the person that sees the president where they report, they will have access via the General Counsel or the external auditor to make an impartial review of the complaint to avoid to be in conflict of interest. I don't know if you, Greg, you agree with that or not, but that would be my solution for someone who is an employee of that organization because of the structure.
Right, right. So I do agree with that. I think what you're trying to do then is structure the position so that you maximize the potential for independence, notwithstanding that the person's an employee. I do agree with that.
Okay, if anybody among our participants has a question, if you just click on the little hand sign, then I can recognize you and have you unmute your microphone. But while I'm waiting to see that, I'll ask oh, here we go. Okay, go ahead, please, Mary.
Hi, it's Mario here. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit, under what organizational conditions would you recommend the appointment of an ombudsman? And what do you think of this? There's a trend now to appoint one in the area of psychological health and safety in the workplace or mental health in the workplace. Do you see any positive potential for that? Okay,
I'm going to mute you again. But I'll first ask you to repeat the first half of your question. That'll be a bit easier for everybody to deal with. So your first half of the question was what, Mario?
Under what organizational conditions would the appointment of an ombudsman be recommended?
Okay, great. Greg, do you want to start with that? Or give it to Louis if you prefer.
Yeah, maybe I'll do that. I'm having a few different thoughts on it. So I'll just step back for a second. If Louis is okay, go ahead.
Okay, Louis.
My initial reaction, you must be very aware of the structure of the organization. And you must make sure that you will remain with the 3 criteria that Greg mentioned: impartiality, neutrality, fairness, to have the trust of the person who makes the complaint. So the minimal condition, you must protect your independence. You could protect your independence by being a contractual outside of the organization, but if you are an employee within the organization, you must make sure you have access to some protection to make sure that you could handle your function without any conflict. That's why it's important to maintain a link with the General Counsel and the external auditor, in my view. I think that's the minimum condition that you must have to maintain a fair and a neutral ombudsman office. And regarding the second part of your question regarding psychology and health, I think it's very important for an ombudsman not to be linked only to his profession. For example, myself, I'm an attorney, but when I look at a problem, when you're an ombudsman, you must be pluridisciplinary or multidisciplinary. You must look to a problem not necessarily from your angle, from your profession, but you must look after an holistic view to the problem to make sure you study the complaint with a wide perspective, not limited to your field of expertise. That's why it's very important, I think, for the ombudsman to be very knowledgeable in the psychology and health, for example, mental health. You must have a wide culture in order to understand well the problem. I don't know if you, Greg, you agree with my statement, but that's my humble opinion.
I think the second answer in particular, that was far better answer than I could conceive of, actually. So thank you for that. If I could go back to the first part, I think what you were saying about structure and so on is important. I think the reasons for having it may be both externally and internally generated. One of the things that provincial ombudsmen have tried to do is to get institutions to have complaints processes, institutions over which they have jurisdiction, because it's better to solve problems in a sense, if you can solve them internally and at the local level, if one can put it that way, before they escalate to having a provincial overseer like an ombudsman get into them. So from the external point of view, internal processes to resolve complaints can be very important. But I think also it's important within organizations to know, and this goes to Louis' point about you want somebody who's credible and has and is seen to be objective and neutral and impartial and so on, because that helps facilitate the resolution of complaints in an organizational setting. There is an issue about the juxtaposition of, say, employment problems with ombuds, because there are often, it depends on whether the environment's unionized or not. So you really have to say, what sort of problems am I having within my organization that I would need an ombudsman? Is it going to be to help the public resolve problems with my organization? Is it going to be for my employees? And that will have different structural constraints. I think that's all I have to say on that.
Is Mario satisfied with our answer?
I'll check with him, but I'll repeat the question, because I think that the second part, Mario also wrote it down, so I can just quote it for him. What do you think of appointing an ombudsman in the area of psychological health and safety? Louis, you said that a person has to have a holistic view and not just be reflecting their own main area of expertise, for example, as an attorney. But that says, well, yeah, if you want that, then you need somebody to have the skills to do it. But that doesn't say that actually an organization ought to appoint an ombudsperson, particularly to look at psychological health and safety. So in your experience, are those kinds of questions ones that are warranted, or that is it a useful or fruitful use of an ombudsman to look at psychological health and safety, or is that sort of outside the realm of things that where an ombudsman can be effective?
To be honest, my experience with two federal organizations, we have a lot of, as you know, health and safety committee. We don't have for each health and safety committee an ombudsman or even a national ombudsman just for health and safety. The actual ombudsman will listen to a complaint regarding health and safety issue as part of his mandate according to his contract. And if you don't have the expertise in, for example, mental health or any type of specialty, he is allowed to go outside to retain professional to help him to make a decision. But it's part of his mandate to review any complaint. So, and when I feel incompetent and I don't have the expertise, I look to make sure I hire a professional in that field, in that specialty, to give me some light to provide, hopefully, many optional solutions. Did that answer correctly the question of Mario?
Let's. I'll unmute them and here we go. Okay, Mary and Mario, how do you feel about these responses?
Yes, thank you. That was helpful. There's a lot of useful information there. On the first part of the question, I was more specifically thinking about if there's a certain threshold of issues within an organization that would prompt the appointment of an ombudsman, as in if there isn't a failure in other checks and balances to deal effectively with certain issues as they emerge, or would you recommend it as a kind of standard preventative measure?
That's an interesting point. Is the ombudsman a standard preventative measure, or something that you should invoke with when issues have reached a certain point, a threshold? Greg?
Yeah, well, I'd go with the it's a preventative measure. But it does depend on the organization. So if you said to me, should every municipality have a local ombudsman, I'd probably say yes, bearing in mind that some municipalities are quite small and there's going to be an expense factor and so on. But just there are so many problems, administrative problems at municipal level, an ombudsman is almost inevitably helpful. It may depend on the organization, but I worry about so you let problems rise to the point where you have to do something. So we might as well throw in an ombudsman. I'm not so happy about that. I think I'd rather look at the nature of complaints generally that you have and the nature of relationships, either among employees, if that's what you're focusing on, or the public and your institution, and saying, yeah, an ombudsman can help solve these problems if we give the ombudsman these functions and these powers. So I think I'd go with the preventative side.
Louis?
Yeah, I do agree with the remark of Greg, and I will add that I see the ombudsman sometimes not only as a prevention for morality. It's good to help the risk management. He's helping the risk management of that organization. And also it's good governance, good control. You have a fair and impartial look from outside. I think it's good for the governance of that organization. And lastly, I think the ombudsman could play a role of a philosopher. And some people will use, for example, in the force, they call me sometime when I was dealing with ethics, the padre, the chaplain. It's giving a spiritual value or the Canadian values, for example. So I think those 3 points add to the remarks of Greg will help Mario.
Great. I'm going to go to a further slide where there were some questions that had come up, and I think that these really reflect some of the discussion already from Mario's question about why to establish an ombudsman office. But the other questions that have been supplied by actually one of the people who are online now and looked at the slides before. What should an ombudsman do, and what should an ombudsman never do? So do you have anything to add on why establish an ombudsman office? I think, Louis, you just talked about risk and good governance and ethics and the kind of the padre function. Anything that you wish to add on establishing an ombudsman office?
I would like to add that establishing an ombudsman office is an opportunity to help to look at the holistic risk management regarding morality. Any organization, I think, have values. You must protect the ethical values of the organization. So I think the ombudsman is there to promote ethics, to promote a good culture, to promote employees being responsible. So I think the Ombudsman Office is an opportunity for any organization to protect that culture. And sometimes I do train, I receive invitation from all across the country from that organization to give sometime a lecture on some issue regarding ethical values. I don't know if you, Greg, you agree with that?
I do. I think you've stated that very well. It really depends on how you see the mandate of the ombudsman. Can I step back and say, why did ombudsman come to Canada? Why don't we just take a second to look at that? The first actually ombudsman was at Simon Fraser University, and the first provincial ombudsman were in the 60s, were established in 1967 in Alberta and New Brunswick. And why did they come? And why did they grow? Every province except Prince Edward Island has a provincial ombudsman. And if you read the Friedman and British Columbia Development Corporation decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1984, they talk about what the ombudsman was there to help with. It was there to help people who were confronting a government that had become ever more complex. They weren't acting for those people, but they were able to investigate problems that those people raised, that they were a way to deal with a state that had become somewhat alienated from and disjointed from people. And so the ombudsman can have that role as an investigator. And yes, I do agree that there's both a spiritual and moral function to what the ombudsman does, and especially when the ombudsman is given broad powers of comment and broad standards to work on. So yeah, I'll leave it at that thought.
I'm going to invite another person who's in the room here at our administrator's office to speak to this point.
Hi, this is Brian Britson following up. As I listened to this, and I had a short chat just before we got started here. As an ethics advisor for this organization, I feel I'm sort of serving in an executive ombuds role. And what I was looking for from the two of you with your experiences, would you draw a distinction, and if so, what would that be between, you know, sort of a formal ombuds role rather than, you know, an ethics role within an organization, keeping in mind that even with ombudsmen, we're going to see different degrees of things like impartiality and also a great degree of variation in different organizations regarding exactly what an advisor would get involved with.
Louis, it's a very good question. To be honest with you, because of budget restriction or organization rules, sometimes you have a dual role. Ideally, in my view, the ombudsman should be completely separated from the ethical officer function. But for example, when I was in the Canadian Forces, I was what they call the ethical champion of my regiment, of my unit. And I try to limit myself to that role. But I know that in some organization, because of the local reality, they want to merge the two functions. I think you're like an Austrian officer with a double eagle head, and you have to make sure that you separate the two functions. I don't know if you, Greg, you agree with that.
Yeah, I do see them differently. I mean, and it's one of the problems with this is you can define the positions to be what you want them to be, and that's what we've seen happen with ombudsman. So I would say an ombudsman is an administrative problem solver and an administrative watcher and a person who can affect change both individually and systemically for people who have problems with the administration, whether it be corporate or public administration. It seems to me an ethics officer has a role in ensuring that certain values are throughout the workforce, and sometimes an investigative role in compliance. And there is a way in which, and I've said this in fact in terms of my role as an integrity commissioner when I was integrity commissioner for 6 municipalities in Ontario, that it is in fact a specialty ombudsman role. If you look at how they're constructed, what they do is they investigate complaints about breaches of a code of conduct, which establishes principles of conduct. They report and they give an opinion, form an opinion, and they report to the council. It's pretty much an ombudsman role. So they can be seen as a specialty ombudsman function, but it really does depend on how you define either officer.
Brian, is that
an example? Louis speaking. I try always to promote ethical values and help the ethics officer or prepare courses for them, a lecture or train the trainer in order to save budget. So I think it's important for the ombudsman to promote the culture of ethics, of all employees must be liable, they must be responsible of their behavior. So I think it's the ombudsman role, if it's permissible according to his contract, but not taking over the job of an ethical officer, who the value officer. I think you have a very important role. And I think the prime role, the prime duty is to the ethics officer to do that. But the ombudsman could support that function, in my opinion. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, Greg, what you think, but.
No, I think that makes sense, yeah.
okay, Brian, is that useful?
Yeah, I know that pretty much confirmed what I was thinking. It really does depend on the organization and how specific that organization gets and the breadth they give that, as well as responsibility they give that, or authority they give that role. So thank you.
Let's go to the other two questions. Louis, could you give a few points that you think what an ombudsman absolutely should do and what an ombudsman absolutely should not do?
Let's see what the points regarding he should do. The ombudsman should have big ears and very attentive, even if sometimes because of his culture or prejudice, you have a different opinion. You must be very empathic. That's very important to establish the trust. The first thing you must do is to establish a trust and try to be very, very empathic to because sometimes You could disagree with the statement of the person who made the complaint, but it must not show. You must be really, really impartial. That thing is the first thing to do. The second thing is to build, in my view, evidence. And maybe it's because of my legal training, I like to build a written statement and put chronology. Oftenly people likes to complain verbally, and they are not very organized in their methodology. You must help the people who make a complaint to build a proper evidence. If you got witness, to have the names and to verify. But I'm a big believer in chronological order. It's helped the people to understand their problem when they put that in writing. The third thing I will do also it's not to influence the people who make the complaint. It's not important what he select. You must give him a lot of option. He must select according to his rationale what is right, what is wrong. He must select the right decision. You must not go to a microwave and give him a solution and say it's the solution. I think the employee must be able to use his judgment to understand the values that we are protecting in the culture. The fourth one, I think you have to do, it's to be, as an ombudsman, humble and modest. We don't know everything. We are limited in our knowledge. I think you must refer the employee to the right professional. And if you want some assistance, I do help the employee, or he goes directly as you wish. But I think you must tell the person that you're not make miracle. At least me, I don't make any miracle. I try to help, and when I feel it's not within my jurisdiction or my competence, and I'm limited in my competence, I will try to help the individual. And the last fifth point that we'll put is what to do. It's coming back to the point we just discussed earlier. It's promote ethical culture, to promote holistic values regarding the organization, the pillar of the organization. For example, integrity, justice. I don't know if Greg, you agree with those 5 recommendations, or what recommendation is a big word, suggestion?
Broadly, I do. In particular, the first and the last. You used the phrase having big ears, being empathic, having empathy. I do think that's critical, and I also think that ombudsmen should exhibit some humility. We've had some pretty good examples in recent times of ombudsmen who kind of lacked that at the provincial level, but those days have passed, I think. What I would say to me, besides those, is that you should have a really clear understanding of your mandate, and you shouldn't go with outside of your mandate. Shouldn't go off solving problems because you're a good person and the person who came to you is a nice person too. You should act within your mandate. One of the first things that surprised me as a counsel to an ombudsman was I had people from that office come to me with problems that were intriguing. They really were intriguing, but they had nothing to do with the mandate of the office. You can only investigate what you're allowed to investigate. You can't go running on. And I think it actually is a kind of contempt of the mandate you've been given if you start to try to expand it. The legislature or the institution established your body to do something. You absolutely should do what's within the parameters of your mandate. That's one thing I'd say there.
Thank you, Greg, for that follow-up, and thank you, Louis, for starting off. How about what an ombudsman should never do? You want to take the first run of this, Greg? Just switch it around.
Okay, in a sense, it's partly the flip side of what we've said, but an ombudsman should never act unethically. Sometimes we're all human, of course. When I first got into ombuds work, there was a discussion about dirty tricks. Could you use dirty tricks in your investigation to get answers to things that you might not otherwise get? And I personally find that appalling. The ombudsman should not do that. You should act ethically in your investigations, in your reporting, in your treatment. So I'd say the key thing is to never act unethically. And I'll leave it at that.
Louis, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would like to, thing not to do is, Greg raised it a bit, is try to exceed your jurisdiction. Often people come to see me with a labor law issue. I'm not an arbitrator. They have a way to make a grievance process when they are a member of a union. You must not replace the existing recourse available to the employee. So you are just there to limit to your mandate, and your mandate is restrictive, limited. So I think it's very important not to exceed your jurisdiction. I think the other thing you should not do is to be partial. If you're in conflict of interest, sometimes people ask me to do some pre-mediation, and after they would like to ask me to file a complaint. I said, listen, I cannot do both. I cannot be, the judge and the investigator. You should not accept a mandate when you're a conflict of interest. You better appoint someone, a third-party mediator, to do it when you will see you will be in conflict or potentially in conflict of interest. The other thing I try to do very carefully, it's not to be near management, too close to management, or too close to any union. You must be neutral. So when I accept invitation, I want to make sure that I don't belong to management and I don't belong to any union. You must remain on the ice and make sure to respect the blue line and the red line. You should not cross the line, because people will think because you go to X golf tournament or X parties, you belong to senior management. You must be neutral. You must not give the impression to some employees that you are part of management, because you are not management. You are different. If you are the ombudsman, you must be always impartial and neutral. And the other thing you should not do, you should not practice as an ombudsman without a proper insurance, errors and omission, what we call professional errors and omission insurance. If you do practice as an executive ombudsman, we are not protected by law, by any legislation. So you must make sure you do carry the proper professional errors and omission. And sometimes your professional organization, for example, the lawyers, will provide you the proper coverage in case of errors and omissions. Like mentioned, Greg, we are human beings and we could make mistakes. I think that's my recommendation of the thing not to do. I don't know if you, Greg, you agree, but that's my humble opinion.
Yeah, that last one is really interesting, because it is the case that a legislated ombudsman, not always, but typically they will have an indemnification that's legislated. And if you don't have some kind of coverage, one thing you can do, one thing I did as an integrity commissioner was to negotiate with every time. I wouldn't take contracts unless they paid for coverage somehow for me. Yeah, that's an interesting issue. Thanks.
I'd like to toss in a very different sort of question. Robert again here. I'm wondering about your intellectual grounding and inspiration in doing this kind of work. It's quite clear that you have to know a lot about the legal aspects of the role, and so your sensitivity to organizational issues and so on and so forth. But you get strengthened in doing this work by reading. I don't know. I'll just make up one. Margaret Atwood. I don't think that's a great example, actually. But is there some trend of thinking or authors that either of you would think help you be happy in that role and feel that you're doing the right thing?
Greg, you want to go first, or?
No, I think I'm going to muddle. I was just thinking not Margaret Atwood, but that's not helpful. No, I'll leave that for a second. I need to think of it.
Yeah. Louis speaking. On my side, to be honest with you, I try to read outside of my field, i.e. law. I try to read in psychology, philosophy, and recently I'm reading poetry from a Japanese or Chinese author. I try to have a broad culture, because the problem I'm having in Canada, I'm serving the Canadian from Halifax to Vancouver. They are from many times from different culture. I want to show that I'm knowledgeable in other field, and I'm learning, especially in psychology. And recently, for example, I did attend from Health Canada a 2-day seminar on mental health. So I'm a big fan of following courses and to make a refresher on some ethical values regarding the Canadian culture. That's along your line of thinking. So I'm reading outside of my field to promote my little knowledge in other specialty.
Thank you. Greg, have some of your ideas come to the surface now?
Well, yeah, I don't know that there's the answer to that. I mean, I agree with Louis that it's good to keep exposed to a wide range of things out in and outside the field. I don't know. Ombudsman, it helps to be a generalist. But you know, again, that depends on how the office is constructed. If you're in the classical model and you're an ombudsman of general jurisdiction, being a generalist is a good thing. And coming from almost any background, you can do it. There's no magic to it. You can learn how to investigate. You can learn the rules of natural justice and so on. And what you bring to it, if you're a theologian or you're a social worker or you're a teacher or a lawyer, and I've seen those professions in ombuds work, you can contribute. And if you're reading in those fields, as long as you're keeping your mind active, I think you can contribute. I'm reading a book right now called Sacred Ecology, which is about traditional Aboriginal knowledge of ecological phenomena. And it's really interesting. But it's just about keeping open to things. And I think I agree with Louis on that.
Okay, thank you. I've unmuted Mary and Mario again, but please come in.
Hi, Mario again, and I was just wondering about the types of powers that an ombudsman typically has. Are they binding or merely recommendations that can be made? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Okay, yeah, I'll give that a try if I may. It depends on the type of ombudsman. So classical or legislative ombudsman actually has very, very strong investigative power. Power to obtain information through summons or subpoena and to summons witnesses to speak under oath. That's about as strong investigative power as you can get. But executive ombudsman, it depends on how they've been constructed, but they will never have those powers, not legislative powers. That's definitionally they will have. But they can have very strong powers. An administration, for instance, could give an ombudsman the power to see everything in the institution, and could require of employees that they speak to the ombudsman. So it does depend on what type it is. I talked a bit at the start about power of reporting and recommending. Ombudsmen typically make recommendations. They don't have the power to order something. There are different examples internationally. So when I'm saying that, I'm really talking about North America and the Commonwealth generally. Although the UK, the Health Ombudsman, and some others now actually have order power. So they're a bit different. But typically, an ombudsman has the power of recommendation and pursues persuasive lines to get things done. It has the power to report, and that is important as well. So I think that's what I'll say for the moment.
To be honest, Louis speaking, I have very limited power. I have power to suggest. I'm making an annual report where I'm making some recommendation to the board of directors, but I don't have any powers, judicial powers, to force people by subpoena or summons. That's quite clear. So my power, like Greg mentioned, is persuasion. I always try to find a solution collectively with the people involved. I'm more as a kind of a facilitator. I'm an executive ombudsman. I'm not a classical ombudsman. So the words I'm using, it's like in my former career as a diplomat. When I was in foreign affairs. You must be a good diplomat to try to find a solution, their solution, not my solution. So to be honest with you, I'm using some mediation technique to help them to resolve the problem. Oftenly, as you know, it's a communication problem. But the only thing I could do, it's really suggestion, except if it's a case of a fraud, something regarding a criminal act, that's something different. But the usual type of complaint have a very limited power, and I want to limit myself, like Greg mentioned, to my jurisdiction. It's very important not to exceed your mandate as it was stipulated. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. That's very clear.
I'd like to pick up on that and go a little bit further, because there was I'm just looking for another slide here. Here we go. On this slide, Greg,
Yeah.
if you look at 21(1)(b), then what we see here is a power to comment on any act or practice that the ombudsman may consider to be unreasonable, unjust, oppressive, or improperly discriminatory. And that implies to me that there's a power there that's almost like the powers that are mentioned. Now I'm going out of my depth here, but when I hear the phrase judicial activism, it's a legislator seems to be claiming that the Supreme Court is doing more than they ought to, and this to me seems to be an invitation to the ombudsman to be quite a bit of an activist with respect to any kind of law in Ontario. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, oh, I think it is. I think it is an invitation to be engaged. It's definitely an invitation to be a watcher of administrative action and to engage in a very profound way and report on how something is working or not working. I'm not sure it's the same as judicial activism, although to be frank, I'm not sure I agree with the phrase judicial activism. Once you decide a case, once you form an opinion, you are actually being active and you have the chance to change something. And that's the role of judges. The ombudsman's a bit different. There's a second part to 21 which talks about making recommendations based on having given the opinion. What's interesting, I think, about 21 too is this isn't the ombudsman going outside his or her mandate. It is his or her mandate, and she is required to give an opinion if she finds these things. So yeah, it is an invitation to be engaged, and it covers a broad swath of what can go wrong in administration.
If I could, Greg, did you finish?
Yeah, sorry.
I just want to give you an example, and as an executive ombudsman, I do recall in Katimavik, I did have a complaint by one of our employees that we should not offer bilingual service outside of Quebec. And the Official Language Act should not be respected outside of Quebec. So I just intervened at the request of that employee. He wants to stop bilingualism, and I said to him very politely that it's a Canadian value that federal organization, Crown Corporation, must offer bilingualism services across the country, including the provinces or territories outside of Quebec. And so sometimes you must, when you see something unreasonable, I said to the employee, I will not accept your complaint because it's against the Canadian law. You cannot be against bilingualism. If you're a federal employee, you must follow the law. And if you're not happy with that, that's your personal opinion. But as an employee of Katimavik Corporation, you must follow Canadian law. And I do strongly suggest that follow the Canadian law and respect the values of the government. If the government changed the law, that outside of Quebec it's different, that would be legally acceptable. But as far as I'm aware, the Official Language Act was not amended at that time, and it's still not. Greg, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I agree with what you're saying. In that sense, you're commenting that it's just plain wrong what the person is saying. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And
okay.
Sorry.
I'm jumping in here because we're down to our last few minutes, and so I wanted to bring up your last slides. Greg, you had forecast that the main organizations would be mentioned, and I'd like to just ask you to repeat a name. Early on, you said something about somebody who has written about the hybrid kind of role, and I didn't quite catch the name. Could you repeat that?
Yes, it's Nora Farrell, Farrell, and I'll get the reference. It's in an article in a book that was published on Ombudsman.
Okay, well, you know what, when we put the slides up on the website, we'll add that. So do you want to comment on anything about these four organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I chose these because in a sense they're the ones that are most common for people in North America. The Forum of Canadian Ombudsmen has both executive and legislative ombudsman within it. The USOA has historically had a lot of primarily classical ombudsman. I think it's now both. The International Ombudsman Institute used to be centered in Alberta. It's now in Europe. It is primarily focused on classical and legislative ombudsman. And the International Ombudsman Association is based in the United States and is primarily focused on executive and organizational ombuds. There are many others, though, and if you're interested in Europe, there are European associations. There is a Caribbean Ombudsman Association, and so on. There are quite a number of groupings, and then if you look at particular countries, you can find their ombuds, and they're very common around the world. So, yeah.
Okay, then let's add a little bit more information before we put the slides up. And lastly, everybody, here's who you've been listening to, and this is a very short summary of some of their activities. For instance, you've heard that Louis Haeck was also the ombudsman with Katimavik before his current role, and that he has military experience. And Greg's list of publications and work in this area is longer than we would want in a slideshow. So thank you very much. We'll be leaving the website for the webinar open now, because we're actually switching to our AGM. Those of you who are listening in for that, thank you very much, and we'll get back to you very shortly. In the meantime, could you use the question box to talk about how we could improve the webinars and what topics you would suggest for future webinars? And as I say here, you can get your comments in other ways as well. And I'm just going to very briefly unmute all of the attendees, so you can all say thank you to Greg and Louis. How do I unmute all? Geez, I'm looking for that now. Oh well. Where's that? Down? Oh, unmute all. Okay.
Muted.
Here we go. It's not working. Sorry, something's not functioning on my screen, so you'll have to send your thanks and compliments silently rather than this way. Okay, thank you everybody. Those who are not attending the AGM, please drop off. Those who will, you're very welcome to stay. Robert here, and thank you very, very much, Louis. Thank you very, very much, Greg. I really appreciate your contribution to our knowledge on this topic. Bye-bye for now. Whoops. Bye-bye, Louis. Bye-bye, Greg.
Bye, have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Leave it for a second.